Bakari Sellers, who's also a lawyer. CNN legal analyst Paul Callan is joining us, and retired LAPD Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey is with us. She's the author of the book Black and Blue. You know, Bakari, what do you see as the prosecution strategy in this phase of this trial?
I mean, you see them still building the case out here that Derek Chauvin did not follow proper procedures and protocol, that his actions were beyond reckless, that there was intent there and the necessary intent there to bring down a murder charge. And you just see it. And also, one of the biggest things that this case is about is causation. And you attempt to see them every step of the way, showing that the cause of death in this matter is the knee to the neck. Today, again, at every step the prosecution makes, you see the criminal defense attorney come back and attempt to push back in the opposite direction. People are learning today what a lethal dose of fentanyl is and what was in George Floyd's system. You're going to hear that more and more and more, increasingly, because we do know that it only takes one juror to believe that the cause of death was something other than, or the substantial cause of death was something other than Derek Chauvin's knee. So we still have a long way to go, but you can see how both sides are attempting to prove their case.
Yeah, it's got to be unanimous for conviction, unanimous for acquittal. If one or two jurors simply vote against the prosecution, there could be a hung jury. Then they'd have to decide whether they're going to start this thing all over again. Let's talk a little bit, Paul, about the two witnesses today who seem to agree with at least some of the defense line of questioning that the crowd may have distracted from the medical care, and that the suspects who are compliant can suddenly become non-compliant. Do you think that was a misstep on the part of the prosecution to raise the possibility for the defense to start bringing those issues in?
Well, I think the prosecution saw that argument coming, Wolf, and prosecutors often try to get these things out in front of the jury so they can explain them later on. And you're absolutely right. The point that came out really was that before you even can call in medical assistance to help a suspect who's in trouble in terms of his health, you have to make sure that the scene is clear and safe. And the implication clearly is that the surrounding crowd maybe delayed things and could have caused part of the problem. I thought that actually one of the more harmful things that were elicited from police witnesses today, I thought, was testimony from the police lieutenant who actually trained Chauvin in proper technique. And he, of course, he was trying to prove that you need proportionate force, appropriate force, not excessive force. And this particular police officer said there was excessive force here. But he did say one thing that I think will come back to haunt the prosecution. He said that in order for a man to become unconscious, it can happen as fast as 10 seconds if there's substantial pressure put on the neck. And I think the defense will turn that on the prosecution and say, this was as 9:29, 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Of course, Mr. Floyd only became unconscious at the very, very end. So that might have been a harmful bit of testimony by the police today.
Sergeant Dorsey, let's talk about those two officials who actually trained Derek Chauvin. One said that they don't train the type of restraint Chauvin used. The other said Chauvin was trained to immediately start CPR when someone is unresponsive. How powerful was that testimony?
Well, it was important to know what the training is, but what people have to remember and understand is that what we do is very fluid, and there are exceptions at every step of the way. And so you have to constantly assess and then reassess what's going on. What is the individual doing, and how do you either compensate, overcompensate? Do you de-escalate? And so a lot of this deals with just what's reasonable and common sense. And we know if sense were common, everyone would have it. And so what we saw was unreasonable. And it's going to be very difficult to explain away when you have professionals, command staff officers, trainers from that department saying, this is not what we expect and teach our officers to do.
You know, Josh, have there been many officers, former colleagues of Chauvin's, who've actually spoken out in support of him since George Floyd's death?
We have not heard many at all, Wolf, and I can tell you I was here last year after this incident. I actually interviewed, just as an example, the head of the Minneapolis Police Union, who's been out there very aggressive, going after people that he considers anti-law enforcement, and even he can't find a nice thing or a positive thing to say about what he saw on that video. So it shows that Derek Chauvin here really is standing alone. I think it goes back to a word that Bakari used a second ago, and that is protocol, and that was the key topic today in court. What is reasonable and how are officers trained to include Derek Chauvin? I can tell you as a former federal agent, someone who now covers law enforcement, the police are taught early on in their training you can only use force that is reasonable and necessary, and especially when you start talking about deadly force, Wolf, only force that is used when there is a threat being posed by someone. Of course, the hurdle the Chauvin defense has to overcome is how can someone unconscious on the pavement continue to pose a threat to you? That is the challenge they face, and I think that is why we are not seeing many people, even in the law enforcement community, come out and support what they saw in that video, Wolf.
Let me ask Bakari if he expects the defense, once they start calling witnesses, to be able to call some police officers who would argue that Chauvin did, in fact, act appropriately.
I don't know the answer to that question, Wolf, because it seems like the whole Minneapolis Police Department has lined up to testify against Derek Chauvin. I mean, they've literally grabbed him by the pants and threw him over the blue wall. You just see officer after officer, detective, sergeant, the whole rank coming out to testify against him. I'm sure that the criminal defense side can find at least one or two officers to come out, and probably an expert to come out to say that his force was reasonable. But one of the other things that I just have to mention briefly, Wolf, is that you're going to start to see an ugly phase of this trial. You heard a little bit of that tone and tenor today. You saw it last week, but you see it more today, where you talk about the size of George Floyd compared to Derek Chauvin. And then last week, where you had the black gentleman who was there, you saw them attempt to paint him out to be angry. And one of the things they're going to have to do, and this just triggered my thought, Josh's comments just triggered my thought, is they're going to try to say that this crowd, not only George Floyd, but this crowd was a threat. And they're going to attempt to build into some jurors' mind this fear of that individual, this fear of that black man, the one that was on the ground and the one that was on the crowd and those members of the crowd. So we have to watch that going forward. That's a criminal defense tactic that we will see going forward next week. And it's going to infuriate us all, but it's only meant to murk up the jury just that much more.
Well, let me ask Sergeant Dorsey, what do you think about that?
Well, I absolutely believe it's true, and I don't know why, and maybe they will, why the prosecution isn't paying more attention to Derek Chauvin's 18 personnel complaints. It's not like this guy is a choir boy, and listen, he's got 19 years on the job, so he's been around for a long time. He's been a miscreant for a long time. Everyone on that department knows exactly who he is, from the sergeant in role, who was first responder, to the police chief. They all know who he is. He grew up on that department with them. And I don't know how they allow him to get to 18 personnel complaints and not pull him out of the field and have him ride the desk or put him in the kit room and give him a box of flares. Certainly there was something else that could have been done.
Let me ask Paul, can they admit that information? Can that be admitted as evidence in his record?
It's very unlikely, Wolf, that can get into evidence unless Chauvin takes the stand. It might be used to impeach him if he took the stand, but I don't think he's going to take the stand, and I don't think the jury's ever going to hear about those prior complaints. This case is going to be decided on what happened and what's been depicted in those videos. And you know, in the end, the videos tell the whole story. I mean, we're going to hear a lot of this testimony trying to justify what the officer did, but nobody can view those videos without cringing and saying something very bad happened here. And that's the thing that the defense has to overcome. It's a big mountain they have to climb to get an acquittal in this case.
Yeah, everybody suspects it's going to get ugly.